Hello, Ross.
Hello, Reihan. How are you?
I'm great. I am Reihan Salam of the New American Foundation, National Review, The Daily Beast, Forbes.com, and a variety of other complex overlapping affiliations. And I'm here with one of my best friends, Ross Douthat.
Ross Douthat of the New York Times, and the co-author with Reihan of a book that we wrote together and managed to remain friends despite having written it together, which I believe is a remarkable achievement among co-authors. And we're here today. It's about, what's the day today? We're 5 days into the new year, but the powers that be at Blogging Heads have suggested that we look backward rather than forward, talk about the year and the decade just passed, and offer some
perspective.
Some perspective,
what we're known
yes,
for, Ross,
exactly.
We're known as very kind of thoughtful, sage, even, fellows who kind of have the kind of rich historical perspective that I think America's trying out.
You know, it's funny you say that, because that's not how I've seen you portrayed in the comment section of the Daily Beast, Reihan. I have to say, I'm not sure that sage is a word that's been featured. Maybe I'd like to boil Reihan's head with some sage.
I think that my theory is that I'm the Emmanuel Goldstein of the web. I'm a kind of there's the 2 minutes hate of Reihan, and it makes sense because when you look at the contours of my head, they really do invite all kinds of suspicion about my deeper motivations. So that's just something I'm going to have to live with.
Yes, well, and phrenology is a complex science, but all right. In any case, so enough throat clearing. So the decade just passed. So we both actually wrote columns in the last couple of weeks on the theme of whether the aughts were really as bad as a lot of people seem to think they are.
Yeah.
And I guess both of us said in slightly different ways that the answer is no. Right?
Might as well face it, you're addicted to contrarianism, is one way of putting it.
Is one way of putting it, right. But oddly, neither piece was written for either Slate or the New Republic, the bastions of deep contrarianism. So the case
tell me about your take. What would your take on why it wasn't so bad?
Well, I was more interested in your take, because my take was sort of, I think, the conventional wisdom of, the blogosphere or what have you, that it was a bad decade for the United States, but not necessarily a bad decade for the world. And so I cited the usual figures about, it was a pretty good decade in China, a pretty good decade in India, not such a bad decade in Africa, a continent that's had a lot of bad decades over the past 50 years. Yeah. Good decade in parts of Latin America, Southeast Asia, and I actually didn't see this argued as much, but I made the point that, the 90s in Russia were just horrible. Yeah. And the aughts in Russia were a period of creeping authoritarianism, and, they were a very bad time to be a journalist.
But there was also a commodities boom that clearly did help Russia kind of rebuild a social insurance state. There was an increase in consumption. There was the emergence of a middle class. So you did have this primitive accumulation phase, and there were many things that were very, very grim about it. But yeah, absolutely, there were bright spots.
And one of my most vivid memories, oddly, of Y2K, the last turn of a decade, the turn of a millennium, 10 years ago, was the announcement that Vladimir Putin would succeed Boris Yeltsin. And everybody was like, "Who the heck is Vladimir Putin?" And I think it's safe to say that that Vladimir Putin has been one of the most successful, defined in both in pure Machtpolitik terms, but also in terms of the support that he's garnered from the country he rules. One of the most successful leaders of the last decade. So that was my sort of and then the point of the column was that. In a way, this decade was a corrective to the high-flying 1990s when America seemed to be just, lapping the world like Secretariat at the Belmont or something. But I think you made a case that even in the United States, right, that the aughts were not, in fact, the worst decade since, Herbert Hoover.
Yeah, I think that part of the issue is that, and this is a point that a lot of folks have been making, and I think it's a very important one, part of the problem is that the forms of wealth that flourished during this decade were forms of wealth that are actually very hard to measure. So, for example, you had the decade of consumer surplus. In the piece, I talk a lot about what economist Amar Bideh, who's one of my favorite thinkers, refers to as venturesome consumption. The idea that, because of our kind of debt-fueled binging on buying stuff, including innovative gadgets, etc., the United States actually did capture more consumer surplus than a lot of other societies did. And another thing that people fail to understand a lot of the time about innovation is that it happens at a variety of different levels, and that the level that the partisans of industrial policy care about the most, R&D, that kind of thing, the actual banging of metal, are not always the most important sites of innovation in terms of capturing wealth for your society. The ground level innovations that turn things into consumer products that people can actually use, and then use in ways that actually build on themselves successively. That is to say, when you're looking at a product like the iPhone, it's a product, many of the important components of it are manufactured in Taiwan, many of them are manufactured in China, etc. But the thing is that the actual process of kind of selling it, distributing it, and the way in which it actually increases the productivity of the retail sector. Consider the iPhone app that is linked to Zipcar. It's an app that seems pretty modest. Okay, you can find Zipcars within a 10-mile radius or what have you. But the thing is that it actually does change the way that urban life works. It makes it more viable for someone to not own an automobile, for example. It's really changing the way that we consume. Jeff Jarvis has talked about, in his What Would Google Do book, the prospect of having transportation companies that are not tied to owning an actual automobile, but rather finding a variety of different means of transportation and kind of optimizing that process. So a lot of these kind of consumer gadgets that, may have been banged together in some other place, we end up through the kind of entrepreneurial innovation, ground level innovation that happens, not uniquely, but really very heavily, very disproportionately in U.S. society. We've captured this tremendous economic boon that, again, is very hard to measure, just as the boon from computerization didn't actually show up in the productivity statistics until the 1990s, or similarly, the boon given by the dynamo and by electricity didn't really show up in the productivity statistics for a while after the initial big investments were made. I sometimes think that what we've made during this decade are big investments in how we think and how we work. So when you think about the landscape of social media, when you think about the way that these kind of different gadgets are paving the way for ubiquitous computing, I think that they're actually setting us up for a potential economic takeoff, provided we don't create huge regulatory barriers in the way of that. So I think that that's a lot of what I dwelt on. But another thing that I would say relating to your observation, and an observation that Tyler Cowen and a lot of folks have rightly made about growth in other parts of the world, is that there remains, on both the left and the right, although I'd say more on the left, this tremendous anxiety about growth in the developing world, and about these, kind of new rising economic powers, and about how they're going to displace us, etc. But the truth is that, when in India they find ways to perform heart lung transplants at radically lower cost, this is something that clearly redounds to our benefit. And I think that one of the big problems of the last decade has been this idea of the global economy flying on a single engine of the American consumer. But the spread of middle-class prosperity to a country like Brazil, etc., this is something that clearly benefits us by also creating new sources of innovation that, again, we can use ground-level adaptations in our own society. And so I am just tremendously optimistic about the next decade, provided we don't completely screw everything up, which is what I'm worried we might do.
Well, right. I mean, because that's the the pessimistic note, though, that you could strike is yes, the growth of a middle class in India and China and Brazil and so on is potentially tremendous news, not only for the Indians, the Chinese, and the Brazilians, but also for the U.S. We don't just have to be the world's consumers. We can have a more vibrant export sector or what have you. The danger, though, is that you do enter a period where American labor, and I don't mean labor unions, I mean labor as in you, me, and everyone who works for a living, is subjected to much more strenuous competition from overseas.
The tradable sector has increased. That's been the big development, and you're totally right about that.
Right, and so you have, I mean, we've talked about this before, but you have, it's not just blue-collar jobs that can be outsourced over time. It also ends up being, pink-collar and white-collar jobs and so on. And the necessity, it's a good thing, but it also means that human capital becomes ever more important, and it isn't always clear that American society as a whole is ready to compete, I think, in the, in the new world of
Yeah.
A middle class in every country.
This was a big theme in Grand New Party, and I think that it is something that I think that other people have cottoned onto. And I think that, one of the signal essays of the decade was probably Alan Blinder's essay on offshoring as the next industrial revolution, and the idea that what you're describing, the offshoring of white-collar, pink-collar work, is something that really will change the texture of life for, kind of middle-class workers. And one argument that he raises, which I find interesting, is not the classic human capital argument that you hear. It's this argument that also, in his own way, Matt Crawford and Shop Class and Soulcraft raised, which is the idea that rather than, let's make us all kind of postgraduate folks who are symbolic analysts, rather it's, interestingly, this new environment means that certain understandings of how you enhance the human capital of kind of the American working class and middle class, the strategies that we kind of imagined were the right ones in the 80s and 90s actually don't make that much sense. So, do we really need more computer programmers when that has become a commodity?
Right.
Stuff like that. And it's, we still haven't really figured this stuff out, but it's something that we really saw begin in a robust way in the 2000s.
Yeah, I guess from there we could sort of turn to talking about overall, I think, there were a lot of attempts to sort of sum up the decade, right? And obviously it was a decade bracketed at both ends by catastrophes, by the attacks of 9/11 on the one hand, and then the economic collapse at the end of the decade on the other. And you could see the decade as, a lot of people talked about it as the kind of return to history, right, after the supposed end of history in the 1990s. And this was a theme both on the left and on the right. I think it was strongest in a way among some neoconservatives, Robert Kagan, for instance. But clearly there was a return to some kind of sharper-edged experience for the United States, right? It was a humbling decade in many ways. It was a reminder that, the United States is not invulnerable, that the United States will not be, the soaring economic hyperpower that it was in the late 1990s forever, inevitably, and so on. One thing that strikes me, though, is that it was also a decade that I think demonstrated the resilience, in a way, of both American society, but also the kind of, modern international world system, if you will, the sort of liberal capitalist world system that really was solidified with the end of the Cold War. And I think that we know more about that system's potential vulnerabilities now, but we also know more about its resilience than we did in the late 1990s. I mean, we know that, we can go through, 10 years of, the world's leading power suffering a massive terrorist attack, being embroiled in 2 overseas wars, ending with, the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, arguably the worst recession/depression since the Great Depression, and as yet, that hasn't brought the system down the way, let's say, the Great Depression itself clearly brought the system down in the 1930s. We don't see real ideological rivals arising, I think, to liberal democracy even now. We don't see, and you could argue this both ways, right? You could say that actually, if some decisions had been made a little bit differently last fall by Paulson, Bernanke, and George W. Bush, the global economy would have ground to a complete halt, and we would have been headed into 20 years of poverty and deep instability and the rise of, the Hitlers and Stalins of the 21st century. So you could certainly argue it that way. I come away, though, a little more impressed, in a sense, by the resilience of global capitalism, liberal democracy, and so forth. And I say that as someone who had... there was kind of late 1990s ennui, in a way, about the sort of end of history idea and so on. And certainly I think anyone, anyone with some sort of outside the mainstream philosophical views might tend in that direction. But like the movie Fight Club, right, was sort of a paradigmatic expression of a certain kind of late 1990s ennui, and it ends, of course, with a huge act of terrorism, a sort of 9/11 style act of terrorism, motivated by a kind of nihilism/fascism/primitivism, rather than by Islamism, but it had, and you can't really imagine that movie being made.
Think about
today.
Fight Club and Avatar lined up next to each other, in which, the protagonist in Avatar ends the film, I hope I'm not giving anything away, but just talking
Spoiler
about
alert.
sending the humans back to their despoiled planet in this utterly contemptuous kind of way, just as the would-be terrorists in Fight Club, kind of talk about their contempt for kind of consumer society and what have you. It's interesting, very different movies, but a kind of funny recapitulation in this over-the-top, kind of kooky way with Avatar dolls being sold as part of Happy Meals at McDonald's across the country.
Well, that's true. And Avatar, right, hits a kind. I mean, Fight Club was not a big hit. It was a movie that people like you and me watched in college dorm rooms.
People like you and me watched in college dorm rooms maybe more often than was healthy.
Yes. Actually, I had that playing on a loop for about but right. No, there is an interesting parallel there. But so what? I mean, what are your sort of deep thoughts on the decade?
I have to say, I think that what you were saying regarding, I'm kind of interested in the kind of lessons that we take from a decade, and the way that kind of we all have a kind of ideological narrative that suits us of the decade, and I've always been struck by, well, this was the decade of tax cuts and deregulation, and those things didn't work. So, and it's interesting because I guess that's one way of looking at it, because a certain kind of tax cut happened, tax cuts that weren't paid for, and a certain kind of deregulation happened, namely deregulation that was engineered by financial elites, kind of that was designed to actually entrench their position relative to other, potential new entrants, etc. But it doesn't strike me as the kind of real thing that I think of as being at the heart of what I think of as my political ideology, which is decentralization, robust competition, and I think that this was a decade of faith in kind of very, very big ideological projects, and I don't think that has fully petered out. I think that when you look at George W. Bush, you look at him starting out as a leader who promised a kind of humility, who promised to speak softly and carry a big stick, and who critiqued the project of nation building, etc. Yet, in a moment of crisis, he was drawing all these narratives that were far more ideologically ambitious, and that emphasized, if not the omnipotence,
right,
certainly the tremendous outsized strength of the United States to reshape the international order. And I think that, that is something that is tied up to social class, something that you talked about in your awesome book, Privilege, in my favorite chapter when you were describing the kind of ideological sensibilities of the late 90s. It's a kind of recapitulation of Victorian liberalism. It's not obvious to me that this social class that flexed its muscles during the 2000s, both as kind of financial masters of the universe, as folks who pursued a highly ambitious foreign policy. And again, these aren't always the same exact people, but it is, I think, a shared sensibility. Now the project is, how can we utterly remake the American economy in our own image, rather than rely on the messy, sloppy process of entrepreneurship that is, of course, necessarily wasteful because it involves moving beyond the frontier of best practices of today, of expectations of today. I'm increasingly in the camp of someone like an Arnold Kling, who just thinks that, the real issue is concentration of power. That's always been the struggle. And Chris Hayes wrote a brilliant piece about China in which he posited that, increasingly the tension, or rather one tension that's a more instructive tension to pay attention to, is not so much a left-right tension as a kind of Jane Jacobs versus Robert Moses, tension in the world, or J.K. Galbraith versus, say, Hayek. Between people who are kind of embracing these high modernist projects of how do we utterly remake society versus people who have taken on a deep skepticism about that. That's
well, right. I think one really interesting way to look at the aughts, right, is to assume that there is an elite class that is not particularly ideological, that they sort of, they lean left on social issues, let's say, and lean slightly right on economic issues and so on. But they have a deep belief in in the idea of sort of projects and in the idea of achieving mastery and so on. The idea that government should be doing big things, and this class was captured for a while by the neoconservative impulse to remake the Middle East, you might say. And I mean, if you look back at the debates over the Iraq War, one of the really interesting things about them that's, a lot of people would like to forget now is the extent to which the sort of neoconservative line became an establishment line, not the only establishment line, right? I mean, the Washington Post endorsed the invasion. The New York Times did not.
Tom Friedman was its most articulate proponent, although he certainly would disavow the neoconservative label. But yeah,
he would disavow the label, right? But he would still say, I mean, you could, there were a lot of people like that. The sort of liberal hawks who supported the war and so on. And obviously, the Iraq War did not go as its architects initially hoped. But you see a similar thing now, where you have, instead of the neoconservatives, the ideological energy comes from the political left. But there's an assumption among sort of, right-thinking, somewhat nonpartisan journalists in Washington that the project of healthcare reform must be accomplished. And obviously healthcare is nothing like the Iraq War in its substance, but there are similarities, I think, in the way the debate has proceeded and the sort of the assumption that this thing must be accomplished and the sausage must be made and so on.
Oh, this is definitely. I mean, I wrote a column comparing liberals and health reform to conservatives in Iraq that raised a lot of eyebrows and.
Well, right, and it is an unfair. It's not. The important thing to see with this comparison is not that you're saying that reforming the American healthcare system is the equivalent of, invading a country, toppling its leaders, and so on.
Right, and obviously, in one case you had huge numbers of civilian deaths, and in another case you have people who are earnestly trying to, rescue people from the dangers that are introduced when you don't have adequate health insurance coverage. I mean, I absolutely get that, but I think that the deeper point, and it's something that I think that we both feel in different ways, is that I think that we should all have come away from the 2000s chastened by the idea that you can pursue these kind of grand projects, that you can actually remake society, that you can remake the economy in a way that's going to go as planned, that's going to go as anticipated. And I think that, I just kind of feel like just as in Iraq you had a lot of wishful thinking, I think that you saw a lot of wishful thinking with regard to how health reform is likely to proceed. And I think that, again, they're not comparable in terms of, in so many ways. But I do think that, there is just a way in which, kind of the belief that, well, our intentions are good and righteous, and so it's going to turn out as planned, and so it's going to turn out incredibly well. I just think that that's a dangerous mentality that we haven't surrendered. And my hope is that, maybe the right can reform itself by becoming the carrier of that insight. And it's going to take a long time to live up to that. It's going to take a long time of having to make up for the excesses of the right.
Well, right, because one of the things. I mean, you said earlier that you felt like tax cuts and deregulation were tried and failed. Isn't the story of the aughts, because that doesn't get at the subtleties of the kind of tax cuts, the kind of deregulation, and so on. And that's all true up to a point, but it is also true that the political movement in the United States that champions tax cuts and deregulations got at least some of the tax cuts and deregulations that they were pushing for, and the results were not what were hoped. Let's say. I mean, I think it's interesting. There's people have been talking a little bit about the way the Bush tax cuts were passed, the fact that there's a sunset provision. And the fact that the Republicans were unwilling to accept a smaller permanent tax cut. They wanted a larger temporary tax cut. And the assumption was that, this would be, one, so popular, and two, so economically successful that it would be, that it would be
the
easily...
case would be self-evident.
The case would be self-evident. It would become a winning issue for Republicans in 2008 and 2010. Oh, we need to, restore the Bush, or renew the Bush tax cuts because they've worked so well, and so on. And obviously there are 60 zillion factors at work in the economy of the last 10 years, but it's pretty clear that a particular attempt to rerun the Reagan playbook didn't work out as planned.
Yeah, and I think that there are plenty of supply setters who will object, saying that, oh, they didn't do enough regarding marginal tax rates, too much of the tax cuts went to things that you and I care about, like a child tax credit, et cetera. I think that, it's these kind of internecine things seem silly. I think the broad point that you raise is absolutely correct. I think that, to me, I guess I feel as though one of the big disasters of the decade, and this is building on the disaster of the 90s too, is actually a particularly American version of industrial policy that focused on housing. I've been banging this drum for a long time, but just this idea that actually manufacturing a housing boom was our answer to export-oriented industrial policy in East Asia. It was our way to provide work for less skilled men who would otherwise be frozen out of the labor market or otherwise see their labor market position deteriorate further than it actually did. It was a way to gin up growth. For in South Korea, it's going to be the chaebols. It's going to be sort of these conglomerates, or Japan, the karetsu, or what have you.
Right.
And here, in our country, it happened to be this kind of interlocking directorate of large financial firms, home builders, et cetera, that kind of obviously had a particular weight and influence in the Sun Belt, but also throughout the country more broadly. The real estate industrial complex has shaped the tax code in a whole slew of ways, and they continue to do so into the Obama administration in ways that I think are pretty pernicious and have actually really shaped labor mobility, our economy in so many consequential ways. So that's why I think it's funny, when people talk about how, oh, well, we need to try industrial policy because, after all, the East Asians do it so shrewdly. Well, no, we have. We've tried it in an American vein, and it hasn't worked because, what's happened in East Asia has happened to us, which is that, there's regulatory capture. What happens is that you have oligarchs who kind of seize control of the policy. And I just...
I think the whole home mortgage issue is a cautionary tale, particularly for people like me who sort of, I look at the debates about how to reform government and so on through the lens often of, well, if you're not going to do away with government programs, how can you reshape them to pursue
make them more pro-ownership?
Right, more pursue conservative objectives, better, family stability,
this is clearly something that we both share.
But this was the theory behind. For a lot of, obviously this was a bipartisan policy, and a lot of the mortgage stuff was heavily emphasized, especially, extending easy credit to low-income communities was heavily emphasized by the Democrats for many years. But it was something that George W. Bush, Karl Rove, and sort of the whole compassionate conservatism idea latched onto as a way of, essentially using public policy to further, make Hispanic immigrants homeowners, give them a stake in their society, give them a place to raise their kids. They'll be more likely to be responsible citizens. They'll be more likely to vote Republican, and so on. And obviously, it didn't work out. And so, it's a cautionary tale for a lot of people, but it's certainly a cautionary tale, I think, for us.
Yeah, I think
for me, I think you've moved. I think we've both moved in certain ways in a more a more libertarian direction. I think you've always been quite sympathetic to a lot of libertarian ideas, but I think the experience of the last couple of years, I think, has led us both towards, you cite Arnold Kling, the sort of idea of reducing concentrations of power as a very important policy goal. But how you do that is obviously another problem entirely.
Yeah, I think that I've been thinking about just this whole idea of how does one frame. And also just this idea that, since writing Brand New Party, a book that I still stand behind, absolutely, I think that it was an important book. I think that our diagnosis of the discontent of the American working class was dead on. But it certainly is true that a lot of our liberal friends, I think, have been critical, sensing that we've moved further to the right, that we've become more harshly partisan over the course of the first year of the Obama administration. And in thinking about this, I kind of think that, well, part of it is inevitable when the other side is in power. You are going to be critical, and you're going to highlight the differences that you have with the left. Another thing is psychological. I think that this is true for both of us. When you're taking on the Bush administration, there was a way in which, as conservatives, we felt some ownership. And so when you see them, taking policy stands that you take strong objection to, you're going to be sharp with them. And so in a way, we didn't really feel like we were on the team. we felt like, of course we're going to snipe at these guys because we think that they're actually veering away from the kind of conservative principles that we value. And so your allies are these thoughtful liberals who are making critiques that, where we say, hey, you've got a pretty good point there. I think that one thing that I've discovered, and I don't want to speak out of turn for you, is that actually a lot of these left-of-center thinkers have proven to be pretty intensely partisan, in part because they have this very intense partisan but also cultural identification with the folks who are running this Democratic White House, which is very different from our stance vis-a-vis the Bush White House. And so, in a way, given that this is the echo chamber that, we're exposed to, it actually inclines us to be a little sharper in our opposition. And, when we feel as though, well, these are decisions that are being made in this wrong direction, we have to make ourselves heard. But well, this a very funny thing, yeah.
The other thing to say is that anyone who would certainly, I don't want to speak for myself, but certainly accuse you of being one of the sharpest or most unfair critics of the Obama administration hasn't been reading very many critics of the Obama administration over the past year. It seems to me that a lot of the people who are objecting to your stance are people who, as you say,
they've come to
saw you as a
critics.
conservative critic of the Bush administration, and then expected you to become a liberal once liberals were in power, or more aptly, saw you as a kind of center-right to centrist critic of the Bush administration, and then wanted you to embrace the center-leftism of the Obama administration.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's, obviously people can disagree. I don't think that that's a particularly productive role for a right-of-center writer to take on in early, or in the first year of an incredibly ambitious, fairly partisan and left-wing administration.
Well, it's also, man, what do you think, though? Because you've gotten a very similar reaction, although I think it could be because you've been writing a lot on cultural topics, topics where, you actually do have a sharper divide. What is your kind of meta-thought about how you've changed and things, from the book that you wouldn't necessarily disavow, but,
there are a few things, right? I think one thing to keep in mind is that the fiscal position of the United States has changed dramatically in just the past 3 years. And I think that has shifted my attitude to some extent on government spending. I think if you look back at the proposals that we made in Grand New Party that I think are the most unrealistic at this point, and I don't think there are actually that many, but are the ones that involve dramatically increasing government spending on a few, we talked about a wage subsidy program for lower income Americans, we talked a little bit about spending more money on, summer education, scholarships, and so on, and those don't seem to me to be realistic policy goals at the moment. And I think that you have to recalibrate to some extent. I'm not somebody who's spent much of my life worrying deeply about deficits, but I think it's something that you have to worry about, given both the present situation and the long-term fiscal trajectory of the United States. And I think a lot of the debate about the healthcare bill, right, comes down to the question of whether, to what extent is this bill really a sort of revenue-neutral bill that just takes the money that's being overspent on Medicare and spends it on, people who are getting screwed over by the current system.
Yeah.
Which I think is the laudable version of the bill. And to what extent is it something that effectively creates a new entitlement that will become very, very, very costly down the road? I think reasonable people can disagree on this question, but I think that liberals are being way too over-optimistic about the, supposed deficit neutrality of what they've designed and the long-term sustainability of it.
I can't give up on the dream of wage subsidies. I think that Edmund Phelps is one of my heroes. Edmund Phelps, Amar Bidet, Robert Fogel, these guys are the people I swear by. I think that, in fact, I actually think that if you're going to create an enormous new entitlement, something like low-wage employment subsidies rather than the health reform that we've seen would have been a very smart move. And it speaks to what I see as my kind of broad ideological view of the moment, which is, just this view that we need to move in a much more laissez-faire direction in a lot of directions. At the same time, we need to really tighten regulation of the financial system. Nicole Jelenos's book, After the Fall, is a fantastic history of the financial system, the evolution of the financial system since the mid-'80s. She's a conservative. She's based at the Manhattan Institute. Yet, she's given a real kind of lacerating and very bipartisan take on what's happened. And I think that this is a view that I actually find very coherent, the idea that, you want to create more firewalls. It's a view that a lot of, I think, pretty sharp folks on the right, like our friend Jim Manzi, has also embraced. Yet it's not a view that has a real political constituency, in part because of, I think, something that you were hinting at before when you were talking about the tax cuts and deregulation that happened during the 2000s really were something that a wing of the American right wanted very badly. And it's a wing that I think is very reflexive in its thinking about markets and competition. And the basic view is, well, whatever lobbyists for the financial services sector say, or whatever these guys say, they must be right. And let's have a kind of presumptive bias in favor of big business and wealthy and powerful folks. And one can understand where that comes from. I don't think that it's terribly smart, but it's also the path of least resistance, because again, that's where a lot of the funding comes from. That's where a lot of the personnel come from. And there's a way in which you're socialized into thinking about problems the way that these folks think about problems. That's actually true of the left as well. I mean, you have a lot of Democrats who kind of raise this really smart critique, and Micah Sifry has alluded to this in Tech President, but just this idea that the thing about Obama is that he's someone who is comfortable with working with the system as it is. And, this invokes David Ferdoso's argument vis-a-vis Barack Obama in Chicago. He was not personally corrupt, but he was someone who was willing to work within the context of a system that was, not exactly super squeaky clean. Similarly, coming to Washington, there are a lot of people who hoped this is a guy who really wants to be what Fred Barnes said George W. Bush was, namely a rebel-in-chief, an insurgent who is going to take on the establishment and really work to change the workings of government. But in fact, he's a kind of realist, that's a kind of generous way of putting it, who is actually pretty comfortable with these kind of messy compromises. And maybe that's a virtue, and I think that if you agree with his broad policy agenda, it is definitely a virtue. But I think it also reflects the sensibility of folks who are socialized into a world where, a lot of your friends work for Goldman Sachs. The kind of class of people that you interact with and that you think of as smart, sensible people are these folks who, went to Harvard Law School and are now in a position to be donors for your campaign. This doesn't make anyone a bad person, but it is this kind of worldview thing that's very, very hard to break out of. And I think that, even pundits are, minor public intellectuals. We're all susceptible to this kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think the point about when you look at what has been done and what is likely to be done by Obama and the Democratic Congress, the healthcare bill, which is the flashpoint for so much controversy, and the place where conservatives are making their strongest stand, the place where I think the country has, and you can argue about whether this is the left turning on him or the right turning on him or what, but the country has turned sharply against the Democrats. That's still the place where I'm most sympathetic to what the Democrats are doing. I'm deeply skeptical about the design of the bill and its long-term sustainability and all the rest of it. But I think that, on a deep level, our healthcare system is, it does discriminate in ways that are created by the government as well as by markets against people with pre-existing conditions and many low-income Americans. And, the principle, the idea of saying we're going to spend some Medicare Advantage dollars insuring people with pre-existing conditions, right, is not a principle that I object to. The practical measures I have objections to, but the principle I don't. It's the rest of the Democratic agenda, I think, that has pushed me more in a libertarian direction. And I say agenda, some of this is stuff that they just inherited from the financial crisis last fall and from the Bush administration. I mean, from GM to, the government's enmeshment with the banks and so on. This isn't stuff that Barack Obama came into power intending to do. It's just stuff that he, was sort of handed and that happened to dovetail with sort of liberal instincts on a lot of questions, which is that, the marriage of government and business can be really good for the economy as well as bad, and so on. It's the way, it's the way the cap and trade legislation, which probably isn't going to pass, ended up looking when it actually passed the House.
Yeah.
It's these sort of lessons in the problems of industrial policy, the inevitable corruptions associated with government trying to micromanage industry, regulatory capture, all of this stuff. That's the stuff that's, I think, made me more of a libertarian rather than just the push for healthcare reform.
One big thing that I just really want to underline, and I think that you feel this way too, but I mean, I can see the objections because the right doesn't have a huge amount of credibility in this critique of industrial policy because the right pursued its own industrial policy. It was, in the form of the military-industrial complex being the biggest example, and certainly the manufacturing of housing boom is another big example of this.
Well, or the drug companies. I mean, a lot of the stuff that the Obama administration has done with Big Pharma on healthcare was completely anticipated by what the Bush administration and congressional Republicans did with Medicare Part D. I mean, I think, Tim Carney has written this book called Obamonomics, right, which is basically about sort of the marriage of big government and big business. And, it's a book pitched to a right-wing audience, and so it's a book that heavily emphasizes what Obama and the Democrats are doing. But if you read the book carefully and if you talk to Tim about it, he'll say, this book could be called Bush-Obamonomics, right? Like, this is not, it's not an issue that Republicans are coming to with clean hands to any great extent.
I think that this is something that it's such an interesting evolution for all of us. I mean, I still think that for me, the core things about the Grand New Party agenda were the idea of looking long-term, recognizing that direct spending isn't the only kind of spending, that there are costs associated with regulations, etc. Looking at the invisible welfare state rather than just the direct spending on social welfare, social insurance, etc. This gives us a broader perspective of the government's real impact on the economy, and that what we want to do is be more transparent and more honest about this. And that's why sometimes more direct spending and less regulation is going to be the right way to go if you want to have a more flourishing market economy, etc. I think that those core ideas, definitely still have a lot of truth.
And the other, I mean, I think the core idea of the book, right, that I think separates it. I mean, people read the book, which was focused on the situation of the working class in America, and said, here are these guys talking about income inequality, talking about social immobility, talking about the struggles of the working class, and so on. They are one step away from being liberals. But I think that the core argument of the book was that there's just a huge moral difference to us. I mean, lots of people on the left would disagree, but certainly to me, between a society, what you want is a society in which the average American doesn't depend on the government. And that's a crude way of putting it, but I think it's an important way of putting it, that, the virtues of American society do have to do with self-reliance, with strong families, and with all the rest of it. And so what you want, you want policies that lend themselves to a thriving working class, but that doesn't mean that you want policies that just give the working class enough money to, technically bring them up to a greater level of income parity with
this
the upper
is actually a big
class.
thing that you see with regard to New Labour's anti-poverty policies. It's really fascinating because what they did is they had a very clear, explicit...
This is New Labour in Britain.
In Britain,
right.
Yeah. They had a very clear target for reducing poverty. And, the target was met through a much more generous, larger version of the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit. And, basically it was a use of brute force to solve what is essentially a kind of difficult, thorny tangle of kind of cultural difficulties relating to changes in family structure, etc. And, that was another core argument for our book, that you have to look at that tangle, and you have to, be sure that you're actually not doing active harm. And I think that, the thing is that a lot of the things that we propose to address the problem of family breakdown, they seem like weak tea, and they are.
They are,
because
right.
There's only so much that government can really do. But, again, it sort of goes to this idea of having some humility about what you can realistically accomplish, but at least getting the problem right, rather than looking...
and the idea that it's better when you're dealing with a tangle of pathologies, it is better to tinker productively at the margins than to just try and use brute force to
Yeah.
paper over a problem with wealth transfers that's really a problem of culture.
I was on this radio program, and I remember there was a woman who called in to say that, instead of spending the stimulus dollars on the products they've spent them on, we really should have a works program in which, we're putting people directly to work. And I remember, the assumption was that I, the conservative, would object to this idea, but actually I said, that's totally right. I think that's absolutely right because, really the cultural problem of worklessness, neighborhoods in which kind of people have dropped out of the mainstream labor market for a wide variety of complex reasons. That is something that is so pernicious. Or when you look at people who are long-term unemployed, for more than a few months, when you look at alcohol abuse, when you look at what happens vis-a-vis domestic violence, etc. I mean, this is something that really assaults people's self-esteem, and it's something that alienates people from the norms that make the welfare state work, etc. And I think that that's what people don't get, and I think that actually the right, the fact that you have people on the right talking about payroll tax relief, etc., this is not just because, people are tax cut uber alles, etc. It is this belief that actually, in a decentralized way, kind of creating job opportunities for people, kind of where they feel some ownership over what it is they're doing, their working lives, etc. This is really vital in terms of your public respect and your self-respect. And I think that that's an area where I wish the right would place heavier emphasis. And I think that, people talk about a jobs agenda, et cetera, but I think that that's, one thing that is distinctive and very valuable. And I think that that's something where you and I, kind of both feel really strongly and will hopefully continue beating the drum. But, we should talk about other aspects of the decade. It occurs to me that we're kind of
wandering in thickets of our own sort of ideological... So, well, here's a question. Who are the people who you think came out of the decade looking the best? Like, who do you admire from the aughts?
Well, you know that I am absolutely bananas about Mitch Daniels, the governor of Indiana, who
and the next president of the United States.
In my fantasy world, is the next president.
It's a wonderful place to live, though.
You had spending in state governments across this decade grow at a rate of 6%. And no one really asking, how are we doing this in a climate of wage stagnation? How are we doing this in a climate of relatively weak job growth? And he's a guy who said well before you had this huge economic crunch that we need to right-size our government. We need to do it not out of some, not because we have some ideological axe to grind, but because we need to deliver better quality services at lower cost. I think that he is a genuine hero, and
especially
that's why I have a creche dedicated to him in my dining room.
The nativity of Mitch Daniels. Right, and so much of the debates of the last 6 months too have not just been about policy at the federal level, but policy at the state level, and what has happened to state budgets, and this is true in red states as well as blue states, obviously, but it's particularly pronounced in a lot of the biggest liberal states where you just had governments that lived way beyond their means. And, the lessons...
Oh, but Ross, hey, let me just say that conservative states, I see your point here, but, it's, Florida... insanity. Because they thought, well, we'll just keep increasing spending and we'll cut taxes because we're going to rely on this housing boom. And the reason why the housing boom kept going is because they had this state that is, government-provided property insurance for hurricanes and what have you that led to a level of overbuilding we never would have seen. That's a classic example of what, of this kind of right-of-center version of industrial policy that, now people are, and Arizona is another great example of this, but sorry, it's just, it just makes me so frustrated.
Well, right, but compare Florida, compare California, compare New York, compare all those states to Indiana. Obviously, it's a comparison that breaks down at a certain point, but it is. I think that it is possible. A lot of people, and this is an argument you hear from a lot of liberals. I think the argument that a lot of these state governments were it was sort of forces beyond their control. It was, structural forces in California, the cap on property taxes, the supermajority requirement in the legislature.
Oh, yeah.
It's the fact that states can't run budget deficits. It's the fact that the federal government can't just step in and sort of right-size states and so on. But there is a difference between states that had, good government and states that had bad government in the last decade. And
Utah is in much better shape than Florida. Yeah, and Utah was also
right, and they're both right, and it's a good example because they are both. they're
Deep
completely
red
different
states,
states,
yeah.
but they're both. Well, Florida's not a deep red.
Oh, yeah, you're
I mean,
right.
I would contest.
But they both are states that had Republican governors for the duration pretty much.
Right.
And so yeah.
I mean, I think so. Right. So you'll take Mitch Daniels. I mean, I think my the people to my mind who come out looking the best. It is sort of an obvious pick, but the sort of the 1-2 punch of Dave Petraeus and Robert Gates, I think.
Absolutely.
And with some credit given for all her failures, I think as National Security Advisor to Condoleezza Rice as well. I think that the sort of right sizing of Bush's foreign policy, particularly on Iraq, but on other fronts as well, in the last few years of the Bush administration was an incredibly important feat, and one that's, I think it gets the attention it deserves from conservatives who want to talk up the successes of the surge and so on, and who want to rehabilitate Bush's reputation, but I think the people who made it possible don't always get as much credit as they deserve because, first Barack Obama and then the financial crisis came along to take issues surrounding Iraq off the front pages. But if you look at where U.S. foreign policy was in 2005, and
Thomas Ricks' The Gamble is such an interesting book because it shows how basically AEI, Jack Keane, and a couple of people led a kind of coup against the existing Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it really makes you think, wow, AEI, I mean, they were heroes. It's this very different story from the conventional story. On the other hand, a lot of folks who were there definitely contributed to some of the errors that happened, earlier in the war. So it's this kind of funny thing. Yeah, I mean, who comes out really looking untarnished?
Well, this is why I think Gates.
I think
Gates, especially. I mean, with Gates, you have someone who I think, from everything I can tell, was a deep skeptic about the initial wisdom of the Iraq invasion.
In the kind of Scowcroft and
right,
and
but who threw himself really into the work of sort of getting the policy right. And Petraeus too. I mean, you don't know what Petraeus was thinking in 2003, but there are comments he makes that show up early on in press reports about him that make it sound like he certainly had his skepticisms about the initial wisdom of the Iraq invasion, but he was one of the people who pulled it out of the fire. And it has, I mean, this is, the other thing is there's this endless online debate about, to what extent did the surge really work in the sense of delivering, a sort of permanent, stable Iraqi political settlement, which is what, rhetorically, Bush especially and others had sort of, had sold it as saying, this is a temporary military strategy that's supposed to pave the way to a long-term political settlement, right? Well, it hasn't paved the way to a long-term political settlement yet. But there were no U.S. casualties in Iraq last month. And Iraqi civilian casualties fell to the lowest level, I believe, I may be getting this wrong, but I believe since the initial invasion. And I think that that's a staggering achievement. And it's an achievement that I certainly didn't think was possible.
When you were talking to people who were like really close to the policy issues at the time, people who were of a realist bent, what they were saying is that the goal for Iraq is to make it something like Colombia, a society, Colombia during the height of its insurgency, a society where you do have this insurgency that's pretty formidable, but it's manageable, and you still have a state that is broadly representative, that holds sway over most of the country, and that can, through its own resources with some external assistance, basically handle that insurgency. And I think that the puzzle, what we don't know the answer to, is what's going to happen vis-a-vis the Kurds and the Arab populations, particularly the kind of displaced Shia Arab population that Saddam Hussein engineered to kind of be, very close to historically Kurdish territory. Those flashpoints, are still very much flashpoints and are making a lot of folks nervous for good reason. But I agree with you. It is extraordinary how far we've come, and actually there is this kind of slow inching forward of political progress. But I mean, look, if I were a guy who was on the left who said we never should have invaded Iraq in the first place, or when you listen to Howard Dean, who was talking about the dangers of sectarian conflict, well before the invasion actually happened, these guys are still going to feel vindicated, and I don't blame them, for that. So I think that's. I'm trying to be, as you can probably tell, I'm trying to be very fair to our comrades on the left. But it's. I
think, I think people will be debating the Iraq War the wisdom of the Iraq War for as long as we're alive. But I certainly think that on the initial decision to invade, which was obviously the most important decision taken, I think it was an issue where the left got it right. And I can say that they got it right for the wrong reasons in many cases, but that's still something of a cop-out. So it's better to just say they got it right. I think you somewhat disagree, though. Actually, do you? I mean, what do you think?
My view is that, given what we knew at the time, it was not an unreasonable decision to make.
Right.
And I think that that's what we're faced with.
No, I agree. I agree with that.
Climate. But here's the thing. I think that the real thing that I think we all knew at the time was that it had tremendous opportunity costs. And in terms of thinking about, how I was thinking before the invasion and my enthusiasm for the invasion, believing that it was the right thing to do, I think that's where I let myself down a lot, is in not recognizing the kind of incredibly large opportunity costs. And, the truth is that the neoconservative framework is one that I'm very sympathetic to, because the idea of American leadership is a source of a kind of public good of global security. The idea that, in a sense, other democracies free ride on a relative strength, this is an idea that I think is right in very important ways. And the idea that you need to face down rogue states, that you need to actually enforce certain kind of shared normative understandings of the quote-unquote international community, that strikes me as right. And so it's hard for me to say, oh, well, that was kind of obviously wrong, sort of, without kind of this kind of hindsight bias thing. So
right.
I guess that's why I'm kind of hesitant.
Well,
but look, I mean,
well, I think you can make a distinction, though. I think, and I think it's both possible to say that it was a reasonable decision given what we know at the time, and that it was the wrong decision. I mean, I think a lot of sort of historical judgment has to be hindsight based to some extent, and you have to be able to say, yes, given what they knew at the time, I understand why they did it. But it was still the wrong thing to do. I mean, this is when I have arguments with conservatives about,
particularly since there were people who were attuned to the opportunity costs and people who made the right call. So I see your point on that.
Yeah, I mean, when I argue with conservatives, with pro-war conservatives about this, the strong argument that they always make, is the counterfactual argument, is sort of what happens in a world where you don't find a way to remove, right? The sanctions regime collapses, and yes, okay, Saddam did not in fact have the weapons that we thought he had, but he's a force for deep instability in an incredibly important and volatile part of the world next door to, Iran, another force for deep instability. He's going to resume his pursuit of weapons. He's going to, and those two countries together have the power to, destabilize the Middle East in ways more profound than the Iraq invasion did. And that's a potent argument. I guess I just always come back to the fact that, like, to my mind, the level of, instability is sort of a bloodless word for it. So let's say instability and, death and human suffering that the Iraq invasion cost during, and how close it came to ending in real sort of, geopolitical disaster for the United States.
It's like doctors who say that, well, there's a this % chance of this becoming a problem later, but let's just go in and take it out now. Well, people die of medical errors. You know what I mean? Like, it's actually like it reflects a kind of strange understanding, like the idea that we can immaculately make these kind of prophylactic moves in foreign policy, rather than, I think that it's very naive. We have to wrap this up soon, and I really want to hear you talk about movies a bit.
Well, do you? Yeah, I mean, so we'll end with the decade in pop culture. But I mean, what are your what was the decade in pop culture? Is there something you can say? I mean, to me, with movies, right, the decade is the decade of. It's the decade. It's the triumph of the geeks, right? It's the triumph of if you'd gone back to the mid 1990s and said there will be, this. I mean, it starts. When did the first Lord of the Rings movie came out in 2002? But you will have huge adaptations of fantasy classics like Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia. All these superhero movies, to say nothing of Watchmen, et cetera, et cetera. it's an amazing statement about the kind of apotheosis of geek culture. It's been some kind of a disappointment to me as somebody who was never. You were more of a comic book guy than I was.
Yeah.
I was a sort of fantasy novel and to a lesser extent sci-fi geek. I was never a real comic book geek, and the sort of drumbeat of superhero movies, even when, as is the case with Iron Man, they're really good. It sort of exhausted me. I didn't really like the Spider-Man movies. I thought the Batman movies were both solid but overrated.
Me too.
And I thought that, and I loved Lord of the Rings. I liked the first two Lord of the Rings movies better than Return of the King. But I really had higher hopes for that opening a path to more really good fantasy adaptations, and instead it opened the path to the so-so Narnia movies, and then sort of disasters like, Aragon, right? Like just sort of bad fantasy adaptations. I'm holding out a lot of hope for the HBO series that they're making based on George R.R. Martin's unfinished Song of Ice and Fire saga. Geek alert. But we'll call it the Sopranos of fantasy. But so that was the story for me in movies. That was kind of the big story, and then in TV, everybody talks about this, but it is really, it's sort of TV drama coming into its own. I'm still a Sopranos apologist. I know that sort of the consensus in the online world has shifted into saying, well, The Wire was the best TV show in history, and I still think The Sopranos was the best TV show in history. It's an apples to oranges thing, like they are. It's like comparing, Dickens to Nabokov or something. But I think that the level of psychological depth The Sopranos achieves makes up for the kind of unevenness of some of its later seasons. And I say this as someone who loves, I love The Wire. But yeah. So what about? How did you take in the decade in pop culture?
The essay that I really think has stood the test of time very well was Terry Teachout's essay in June 2005 and commentary.
I know exactly what
Culture
you're talking
in the Age
about.
of Blogging. And his basic argument was that this has been a moment of extreme cultural fragmentation, and a moment in which you have all kinds of bizarro virtuosos who've been able to flourish in their little cultural niches and find enough of an audience to sustain themselves, or rather to sustain themselves while also holding jobs as prop stylists or something. That's what I always think of. One of my favorite bands, Yesayer, the guys all worked as prop stylists for a while. And, they're all people who went to good schools, etc. But, they're people who are able to pursue their creative ambitions. Or when you think about a band like the Dirty Projectors, here's
as
a band
I do every day.
They're not a band that sells a huge number of records by any means. Yet they also have received just about enough recognition to be able to make a kind of, a decent enough living, provided they tour pretty aggressively. And that's what's exciting to me. This kind of profusion. So, in popular music, particularly in the kind of critical darling popular music, you see a return of primitivism. You see this kind of incredible kind of pastiche of sounds. You see a way in which a certain kind of genre conventions of kind of rock music have been recapitulated. The way that, you have jazz standards and you have kind of folks who are still performing, Bach or what have you. You kind of have this kind of weird kind of mashup culture that's been really fabulous, I think, for popular music. Although, again, it's kind of popular music in quotation marks,
right,
because it is kind of so much more niched out. And when you're looking at the kind of mass mainstream popular music, what's so interesting is I was in a studio earlier today, and I saw this young woman, Keisha, performing. And it was so weird because it was such a kind of weird distillation of all these different kind of random cultural blah blah. And you have this kind of perky suburban teen who is kind of using this kind of thug argot circa the late 1990s. It was kind of very interesting and weird, a little unsettling, but not unentertaining. Vis-a-vis movies, you saw something similar. Like one movie that I've made a lot of friends of mine watch is this mumblecore movie that's about 78 minutes long called Nights and Weekends by Greta Gerwig and Joe Swanberg. And it's by no means a good movie in the sense that, the conversation is banal, etc. But it's amazing that it could have been made A. B, it was deeply affecting, and it's a kind of movie that you just never would have seen in a theater before because it's kind of like slightly funny-looking people having conversations that one actually has.
Or in no
it's
movie
just-
theater since the 1970s.
Right, yeah, actually, well, the 70s parallels are totally, and that takes us down a whole other eddy, but I just want to throw out a couple of favorite movies from this decade. Red Belt, David Mamet's amazing movie about mixed martial arts, which is my favorite movie of all time.
All time? Really? That's right time. Now? More than Grandma's Boy?
More than Grandma's Boy. Grandma's Boy is in my top 20. Rob Schneider's The Hot Chick, surprisingly good and sensitive and thoughtful movie that I think that folks who are concerned about gender confusion, etc., might actually enjoy. The Station Agent is a movie that I think speaks deeply to my personal character as a tiny person. And I just think there are so many great movies. I mean, that's the thing. Like, for both of us, we were both born at the end of 1979. And for both of us, there's this weird way in which the decades parallel the decades of our lives.
Right.
So for you to tell me that the 2000s were a terrible decade, and by you I don't mean you, Ross, but you, American public, I wag my finger in your direction and say, that's my 20s you're talking about, buddy. And I loved it. I loved every minute of it, and there was kind of horror and tragedy. My parents both worked in the Twin Towers, not at the time, but when I was a kid, and I would go there for picnics, and it ended with a financial crisis that has, kind of made life insanely difficult. We both work in a collapsing industry. There's a lot to rue if you kind of, look at your navel, and you kind of stare at it intently. But there is so much to love and celebrate in Ross. Brazil is like kicking butt.
Brazil is kicking butt.
And Red Belt was the awesomest movie ever made. I mean, it's just, and the music,
wow.
It's just so exciting. Social media, Ross.
This I think is a different. I mean, I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, but I think that you were talking earlier when we were talking about the economy about the impact of Facebook, of iPhone apps on urban living and so on. And I mean, I think that you more than me are somebody for whom the new world of social media was made. And I think I have a more sort of arm's length and curmudgeonly distance from it.
I will digitize you and I will turn you into a digital.
Well, you'll put me right. You'll put me. I mean, this is right. This is the sort of avatar phenomenon where part of the in a way maybe this is an argument I quoted from Caleb Crane today that I think is actually very smart. In a way, the secret of avatar success maybe is. I had written about sort of the ironies of this, the sort of obvious ironies of this movie that's sort of celebrating a return to nature and so on being made with cutting-edge modern technology and so on. Yeah. And Crane's argument is that, well, no, it's not. People are not really experiencing this as a return to nature. They're experiencing it as an entrance into a perfected virtual nature, and that the sort of the way the movie presents itself, you're always, I mean, essentially the Na'vi, the alien race in the movie, they're not like the sort of Indians and Dances with Wolves.
Right.
They're the world you can live in. Or when it's like the singularity, right? Which another sort of phenomenon of this decade, the obsession with among a very small group, but an influential group of people, with the idea that we will soon be able to really upload ourselves. Like, this is what I think Crane is right, that this is part of what Avatar is tapping into, that we're going to, that this we can return to the natural world through, we can enter Eden through technological progress in a way, which I think is a really powerful idea. It's also one that I, as a Catholic Christian, am deeply suspicious of, resistant to, and think will probably all end in tears. And in a way,
but I just want to add one thing, Ross. Please.
Well, I was just going to say. I mean, to my mind, the best movie of the decade, and I think there were a lot of great movies, but is a movie that I think is kind of the anti-Avatar, which is Terrence Malick's The New World. Which is a movie that's about exactly the same subject as Avatar, about this kind of first contact between a more technologically advanced, quote unquote, Western society and a more primitive, closer to nature society. But it's a movie that is completely anti-ideological. I think it's simultaneously the most sympathetic portrayal of sort of Native American culture and the most sympathetic portrayal of the sort of, I mean, the European characters, there are bad European characters in it, but there are also, deeply decent, humane, I mean, the man, Christian Bale as John Rolfe, the man Pocahontas marries, is also presents both the sort of, both the Christians and it's a movie whose human sympathy is enormous. In spite of the fact that there's that much dialogue in it. And a movie whose connection to the kind of, the tragic realities of human life, the fact that this collision of cultures was a huge tragedy, I mean, but also a source of profound beauty, cultural ferment, transformation, and so on, without being escapist in any way.
Here's the thing I just want to throw out. I'm going to say something that's going to annoy a lot of people, but I think that, to me, like, when you're thinking about social media, when you think about, kind of this idea of social graph gluttony, I think what's so kind of powerful and compelling about it is that it's a way to kind of make our experiences richer and more vivid, to kind of allow us to kind of stay in touch with people. When you think about this kind of iPhone app involving the zip car, it's a way in which the digital space actually comes to meld with the physical world in this kind of much richer way. Now, the downsides of that are that there are virtues to boredom, for example. But I think that, and also there have been Jonathan Zittrain had this essay on online labor markets recently. I mean, to me, there's this anxiety about how these institutions will change, will kind of disrupt our security and stability that we've come to expect given a certain kind of economic model, et cetera. But to me, what's amazing about these technologies is the prospect that it will allow us to lead richer and more human lives, and by that I mean, more in tune with our species being as kind of tinkerers and as people who actually fundamentally, what delights us most are kind of new discoveries and sort of, kind of having like rich, fulfilling relationships. And the idea that, these are tools that actually enable that and enable us to kind of create and discover, you know what I mean? And like make, when you think of like recombinations and what have you, I mean, making that easier, closer at hand, making, us all prosumers, people who are producers and consumers, another idea of the 2000s. That is incredible, and that's why I'm really excited.
No, and this is the sort of, the side of me that is optimistic about this kind of networked future is, I do hope that it produces some of the kind of decentralization that we've talked about, the ability of people to do work, the revival of home economies, the ability to do work from within the home, the fact that people's employment, I mean, there are horrible things, journalists know this most of all, associated with sort of the decline of lifetime employment in big corporations and so on. But there's also, there are liberating sides to it, that you can, work for a company in Minneapolis while you're living in Maine and vice versa. And I think that there is, the fact that you can, if your local school isn't giving your kids the education you need, then you can establish. You don't have to homeschool your kids by yourself. You can establish an online and in reality web, a network of interlocking families, interlocking teachers, and so on. I agree. There's tremendous potential for an America in a way that's closer to the kind of ideal of a nation of sort of free, independent, decentralized, self-sufficient people. So that's the hopeful note. But I got to tell you, if you're on your way to upload your brain into the singularity, I'm gonna drain all the gas from your car, and I'm not gonna let you go. Although by then it'll be, it won't be gas. So my plan won't work.
One of the highlights of this decade for me has been getting to know Ross Douthat, and I think
bad. Well, all right. Well, enough. We can't end on this. Is Blogging Heads. This is very serious.
No, it's true.
But yes, right back at you, Reihan. And here's to a wonderful next decade.
Take care to our wonderful audience, and please, buck up, people. Things are rough, but you're not an indentured servant who's laying bricks, for some kind of cool
actually, some of them are.
That's true. It's true. They do. They have broadband connections. All right, guys, take care.
Take care, Reihan.
Have a nice day.